The sound of church bells echoed through the narrow streets of Gloucester, England, sometime in the winter of 1714. The city was cold, crowded, and restless. Smoke curled from chimneys into grey skies, while merchants shouted over one another in the marketplace. To most people, it was simply another ordinary English town struggling through another difficult year. But hidden inside one modest inn near the Bell Tavern was a sickly child whose life would one day shake to continents. His name was George Whitefield. Few who saw him as a boy would have predicted greatness. He was frail, often ill, and born into financial instability. His father owned an inn. But when George was only 2 years old, his father died unexpectedly, leaving the family burdened with debt and uncertainty. His mother struggled to keep the business alive, while raising her children in a harsh environment filled with travelers, drunken conversations, and constant pressure. Young George grew up watching people closely. He observed the arguments of weary men, the laughter of drunk customers, the sorrow hidden behind false smiles. The inn became his first classroom. Long before he preached to crowds, he learned how human beings carried secret pain. He saw how people tried to fill emptiness with noise, entertainment, and alcohol. Even as a child, something about the world felt deeply broken to him. But George himself was not naturally holy. In fact, he later admitted that as a young boy he often loved attention more than truth. He enjoyed performing and imitating actors. He was fascinated by drama and storytelling. Sometimes he would memorize speeches and recite them dramatically before others. There was a fire in his personality that drew people toward him, but it was not yet surrendered to God. What nobody realized was that the same passion that made him love acting would one day make thousands weep under his preaching. As George entered adolescence, the family's financial struggles intensified. He worked at the inn, serving customers and performing difficult tasks while trying to continue his education. Life was exhausting. There were moments when continuing school seemed impossible. Yet buried inside him was a fierce determination to rise above his circumstances. Education became his escape route. Eventually, he earned the opportunity to attend Pembroke College, Oxford, but his arrival there was far from glamorous. He was poor, painfully poor. Unlike wealthy students, George could not afford comfort or status. To survive at Oxford, he worked as a servitor, essentially functioning as a servant for richer students. He cleaned rooms, carried books, and performed humiliating duties just to remain enrolled. Every day reminded him of his low status. The humiliation quietly wounded him. He walked among educated elites while secretly feeling inferior. Many students looked down on servitors. George often felt invisible, unless he was useful to someone. But those hidden years of shame shaped something inside him. The rejection, the poverty, the exhaustion, all of it carved deep emotional chambers within his soul, and strangely, those chambers would later become the source of his spiritual authority. Because broken people often speak differently than comfortable people. At Oxford, George began hearing whispers about a strange group of students who were unusually serious about Christianity. They prayed intensely, studied the Bible obsessively, fasted regularly, and visited prisoners and the poor. Some mocked them and gave them insulting nicknames like Bible moths and Methodists. The leaders of this group were two brothers, John Wesley and Charles Wesley. George was intrigued. At first, he admired their discipline from a distance. There was something different about them. Their faith was not cold religion. It was consuming, intense, costly. They spoke about God as though he were real and near, not merely an idea discussed in classrooms. Eventually, George joined them, but joining the Holy Club, as critics called it, did not immediately bring peace to his soul. In fact, it triggered a terrifying spiritual crisis. George became obsessed with earning God's acceptance. He fasted excessively. He prayed for long hours. He denied himself comforts. He tried desperately to become holy through discipline. He read spiritual books until his mind burned with anxiety. The more he pursued perfection, the more aware he became of his own corruption. He later described himself as spiritually tormented. There were days when he barely ate, nights when he could not sleep. He He pushed his body so hard in pursuit of righteousness that he eventually became seriously ill. Some historians believe he suffered a complete emotional and nervous collapse. The future revivalist was falling apart before he had even preached a single sermon. And this is where many people misunderstand the story of powerful spiritual leaders. They see the public fire, but never the private breaking. Before George Whitefield ever moved crowds, he wrestled in darkness alone. Before thousands listened to him preach outdoors, he battled despair in silence. Before revival power came upon him, weakness nearly destroyed him. One moment especially changed everything. While recovering from illness, George read a book by Henry Scougal called The Life of God in the Soul of Man. The words pierced him deeply. For the first time, George realized Christianity was not merely about discipline, morality, or religious effort. It was about spiritual transformation through knowing Christ personally. That revelation shattered him. He suddenly understood that he could never save himself through performance. No amount of fasting or religious striving could heal the emptiness inside him. Salvation was not earned, it was received, and in that realization, George Whitefield experienced what he later described as being born again. The change was immediate and overwhelming. The Bible came alive to him. Prayer became joyful instead of burdensome. Christ no longer felt distant. A burning love for souls awakened inside him. He began speaking passionately about spiritual rebirth, not as a theory, but as a living reality he had personally experienced. Yet even then, the struggle did not disappear, because when God calls someone publicly, preparation often happens painfully. George began preaching small sermons, and people noticed something unusual. His words carried emotion, urgency, conviction. He did not preach like a detached academic. He preached like a man rescued from drowning, who was warning others about the storm. Some listeners were moved to tears, others were offended. Religious leaders grew uncomfortable with his intensity. His preaching exposed dead religion and challenged comfortable Christianity. He spoke about sin with startling honesty, but he also spoke about grace with overwhelming passion. Crowds were beginning to gather, and George himself was beginning to realize something frightening. God might actually use him in ways far beyond his imagination. But the deeper his influence grew, the heavier the pressure became. Inside him still lingered insecurities from childhood, fear of failure, fear of rejection. The emotional scars of poverty and humiliation had not vanished overnight. Even while preaching boldly, George often wrestled internally with exhaustion and inadequacy. What appeared outwardly as confidence was often inwardly sustained through desperate dependence on God. And perhaps that is precisely why his preaching carried such unusual power. Because people could sense authenticity, George Whitefield was not merely delivering sermons. He was pouring out a soul that had been crushed, rebuilt, humbled, and consumed by divine grace. The fire people admired publicly had been forged privately through suffering, and soon that fire would erupt far beyond Oxford. The young preacher, who once cleaned rooms for wealthy students, was about to stand before thousands in open fields. His voice would thunder across England and eventually across colonial America. Entire towns would be shaken. Crowds would collapse in tears. Revival would spread like wildfire. But with greater influence would come even deeper struggles, because the next phase of George Whitefield's life would test him in ways he never expected, and the burden of revival power would soon begin costing him far more than he imagined. The fields were packed long before he arrived. Men climbed trees for a better view. Women stood holding children against their shoulders. Farmers abandoned their tools. Coal miners walked miles covered in black dust just to hear him speak. Some came out of curiosity. Others came to mock him. But nearly everyone who encountered George Whitefield left deeply affected. By the late 1730s, something extraordinary was happening across England. Churches had begun closing their doors to Whitefield because his preaching was considered too emotional, too confrontational, and too disruptive. Many religious leaders believed he was dangerous. They accused him of stirring fanaticism among ordinary people. Some said he lacked dignity. Others believed he was ruining the order of the church, but rejection only pushed him toward a decision that would change history. If the churches would not allow him to preach inside their buildings, then he would preach outside. It sounded outrageous at the time. Preaching in open fields was considered improper and undignified for an ordained minister. Respectable clergymen stayed inside church walls, but Whitefield was becoming convinced that souls mattered more than tradition, and so he stepped into the fields. One of the most famous moments occurred near Bristol, where thousands of coal miners gathered to hear him preach in the open air. As Whitefield spoke about sin, grace, and salvation, hardened workers who rarely showed emotion began openly weeping. Black coal streaks formed down their faces where tears cut through the dirt. It was a scene witnesses never forgot. Whitefield had discovered something terrifying and beautiful at the same time. The human heart was starving for spiritual awakening, and he possessed a voice that could awaken it. People often described his preaching as almost supernatural. He could move from thunderous intensity to heartbreaking tenderness within moments. His face became animated, his eyes filled with tears. Sometimes he shouted warnings with prophetic force. Other times he spoke softly enough to make entire crowds lean forward to hear him. Even famous skeptics were stunned by his ability. Benjamin Franklin, who was not known for emotional Christianity, became fascinated by Whitefield. Franklin once tested the preacher's voice scientifically by walking away through a crowd while Whitefield spoke, measuring how far the sound could carry. He concluded that tens of thousands could hear him at once without amplification. But Whitefield's power was not merely vocal. It was spiritual intensity forged through suffering. When he preached about grace, people sensed he had personally needed it. When he warned about eternity, listeners felt he genuinely believed every word. There was no cold professionalism in him. He preached as though heaven and hell stood before every crowd. And soon, revival exploded. His influence spread beyond England into the United States during what historians would later call the Great Awakening. Town after town experienced overwhelming spiritual response. Churches overflowed. Public morality shifted. People gathered in homes for prayer late into the night. Entire communities became consumed with conversations about salvation. Whitefield became the most famous preacher in the English-speaking world. But fame introduced a new battle. The greater the crowds became, the more intense the criticism grew. Newspapers attacked him relentlessly. Religious leaders accused him of manipulation. Some claimed emotional responses during his meetings were exaggerated hysteria. Others mocked his dramatic delivery and theatrical gestures. Ironically, the same communication skills that made him powerful also made critics suspicious. They remembered his youthful love for acting and accused him of performing religion harder than preaching truth. Whitefield was wounded by these attacks more deeply than many realized. Though bold in public, he remained emotionally sensitive underneath. Harsh criticism often followed him into private moments. He read pamphlets written against him. He heard rumors questioning his sincerity. Sometimes even fellow ministers turned against him, and perhaps the most painful conflict emerged between Whitefield and the Wesley brothers. At first, John Wesley and Whitefield had worked closely together in ministry. Both preached passionately about spiritual rebirth. Both challenged dead religion. Both longed for revival. But theological disagreement slowly created division. The central issue revolved around predestination and free will. Whitefield strongly embraced Calvinistic theology, believing deeply in God's sovereign election. Wesley fiercely opposed those beliefs, arguing they undermined human responsibility. What began as private disagreement eventually became public tension. Pamphlets were written. Sermons responded to sermons. Supporters on both sides intensified the conflict. Crowds whispered about division among revival leaders. Many expected bitterness to destroy the movement completely. For Whitefield, the controversy was emotionally exhausting. He genuinely loved the Wesleys, especially John, but conviction pulled them apart publicly even while affection remained privately. The strain revealed another hidden burden of revival ministry. Spiritual movements often carry painful relational fractures. Yet despite conflict, Whitefield continued preaching relentlessly. That word relentlessly barely captures the reality. He crossed the Atlantic Ocean repeatedly, under dangerous conditions. He preached multiple times a day, for weeks without rest. He traveled through storms, illness, mud, freezing temperatures, and physical exhaustion. Sometimes he delivered sermons, while barely able to breathe. His body was deteriorating under the pressure. Whitefield suffered from asthma and chronic respiratory issues that worsened over time. There were nights when he struggled desperately for air after preaching. Friends begged him to slow down. Doctors warned him repeatedly, but he refused to stop. Because somewhere deep inside him burned an unbearable urgency. He believed souls were slipping into eternity every day. That conviction drove him harder than his physical body could sustain. Yet another hidden struggle haunted him: loneliness. Crowds surrounded him constantly, but true rest became rare. Fame isolated him. People admired the preacher, while often failing to understand the man underneath. Revival made him celebrated publicly, but exhausted privately. And then came the accusations surrounding money. Whitefield raised funds for an orphanage in Georgia called Bethesda. Though his intentions were sincere, financial controversies emerged repeatedly. Critics accused him of mismanagement and manipulation. Some even suggested he used revival meetings for personal gain. The attacks crushed him emotionally. Whitefield had sacrificed comfort, health, and stability for ministry. Yet many still questioned his motives. The misunderstanding became another heavy burden he carried silently while continuing to preach. But perhaps the deepest contradiction in his life involves slavery. Whitefield publicly advocated for the legalization of slavery in Georgia because he believed it would financially sustain the orphanage. Historians continue wrestling with this painful part of his legacy. The same man who preached passionately about spiritual equality failed morally in ways that still grieve readers today. It is one of the hardest realities in his story. Revival power did not make him flawless. Like many influential figures in history, Whitefield carried both remarkable spiritual impact and serious human weakness. His life reminds us that God often works through imperfect vessels rather than ideal heroes. Still, the revival continued spreading. Thousands kept gathering. Letters describing transformed lives circulated across cities and colonies. Even opponents admitted something unusual surrounded his ministry. Whitefield's sermons seemed to awaken spiritual hunger wherever he traveled. But behind the scenes, his body was nearing collapse. Years of endless preaching, travel, controversy, emotional pressure, and physical suffering were slowly consuming him. His voice remained powerful, but his strength was fading. Friends noticed how tired he looked. Breathing became more difficult, yet he continued pushing forward with almost frightening determination. Because George Whitefield had become convinced of something that would ultimately define his entire life. He would rather burn out than slowly fade away. And soon. That decision would carry him toward his final journey, one that would end in exhaustion, heartbreak, and a legacy powerful enough to echo across generations long after his voice fell silent forever. By the time George Whitefield entered his 40s, his body already resembled that of an old man. Years of relentless travel had worn him down physically. Endless preaching had strained his lungs and voice. Sleepless nights, harsh weather, emotional stress, criticism, and constant responsibility had carved visible exhaustion into his face. Yet despite his deteriorating condition, Whitefield continued pressing forward with almost terrifying intensity. Many around him feared he was killing himself. But George believed he no longer belonged to himself. That belief shaped every decision he made. He traveled across England, Scotland, and colonial United States again and again, often enduring dangerous conditions that would have broken most men. Ships crossing the Atlantic faced violent storms capable of sinking entire vessels. Roads were muddy, unsafe, and exhausting. Accommodations were uncomfortable. Illness spread easily. Yet Whitefield kept moving, as though driven by an invisible urgency that refused to release him. The strange thing was this: The weaker he became physically, the more powerful his preaching often seemed spiritually. Crowds still gathered in massive numbers. Some traveled 4 days to hear him. Entire towns shut down when news spread that Whitefield was arriving. Farmers left fields, merchants paused business, families packed together under open skies waiting for the famous preacher whose sermons seemed to pierce directly into the soul. Witnesses described overwhelming scenes during his meetings. People cried openly, some trembled under conviction, others fell to their knees praying aloud. Hardened skeptics unexpectedly broke into tears. Whitefield's words seemed to awaken spiritual awareness buried deep within ordinary people. Yet after the crowds disappeared, silence often returned, and inside that silence, Whitefield faced battles nobody fully understood. There were nights of deep loneliness, moments of crushing fatigue, private seasons where emotional heaviness settled over him. Storm cloud. The burden of revival is something history books rarely explain properly. People celebrate the visible impact, but often ignore the invisible cost carried by those leading it. Whitefield constantly carried expectations from thousands of people. Supporters viewed him as a spiritual giant. Critics watched closely for failure. Churches debated him. Newspapers analyzed him. Crowds demanded more sermons. But underneath the public influence remained a fragile human being, and fragility became painfully evident in his marriage. In 1741, Whitefield married Elizabeth James Whitefield, a widow who deeply admired his ministry. But marriage to a revivalist was not easy. George spent enormous amounts of time traveling, preaching, and organizing ministry efforts. His calling constantly pulled him away from home. The emotional distance created strain. Though Whitefield cared for Elizabeth, ministry frequently overshadowed family life. Historians note that their relationship often carried loneliness and difficulty. One heartbreaking tragedy especially marked them deeply. Their infant son died only a few months after birth. The loss devastated them. Whitefield preached to thousands about hope and eternity, yet privately he grieved as a father burying his own child. The pain cut deeply into both George and Elizabeth, adding another hidden wound beneath the surface of public ministry. Still, he kept preaching, perhaps because preaching itself had become intertwined with his identity. Without the crowds, without the sermons, without the movement, who was George Whitefield? That question quietly haunted him. Revival leaders often become trapped between divine calling and personal exhaustion. The world sees their usefulness, but rarely notices their humanity. Whitefield increasingly lived inside that tension. Meanwhile, criticism never stopped. Some accused him of emotional manipulation. Others attacked his theology. Rival ministers challenged his methods. Newspapers mocked his dramatic preaching style. One critic even compared him to a stage actor performing for applause. Those accusations wounded him because they touched an insecurity he had carried since youth. Whitefield knew he possessed unusual communication gifts. He understood how his voice affected people emotionally, but he also genuinely believed the gospel deserved passionate proclamation. The line between emotional persuasion and spiritual conviction became a battlefield critics constantly used against him. And then there were the divisions inside the revival movement itself. The disagreements with John Wesley never completely disappeared. Though the two men eventually reconciled relationally, theological tensions remained. Supporters on both sides sometimes deepened conflicts unnecessarily, turning spiritual disagreements into public controversy. Whitefield hated division more than many realized. He longed for unity among believers. Yet revival movements often attract conflict because powerful spiritual awakenings stir strong emotions, strong opinions, and competing visions. Still, even amid disagreement, Whitefield's respect for Wesley endured. In fact, when someone once asked Whitefield whether he expected to see John Wesley in heaven, he famously replied that Wesley would likely be so close to the throne of God that Whitefield himself might not even catch sight of him. That statement revealed something profound about George Whitefield's heart. Despite his flaws, despite controversy, despite intense convictions, humility increasingly shaped him as he aged. Suffering had softened him. The young man, once driven by insecurity and ambition, was gradually becoming a weary servant entirely dependent on grace. And perhaps that transformation explains why his final years carried unusual spiritual depth. People noticed it in his preaching. There was greater tenderness now, greater urgency, greater eternal perspective. Whitefield no longer preached merely with youthful fire. He preached like a man standing near the edge of eternity himself. Because deep down, he knew his strength was fading. Asthma attacks worsened over time. Breathing became increasingly difficult. Sometimes he could barely climb stairs. Friends begged him repeatedly to rest. Physicians warned him to slow down before his body collapsed completely. But Whitefield answered with words that revealed the intensity burning inside him. "I would rather wear out than rust out." That sentence became the philosophy of his life, and he lived it literally. Even when exhausted, he continued scheduling sermons. Even when sick, he climbed platforms to preach. Even when barely able to breathe, he kept proclaiming the message that had once rescued his own broken soul years earlier at Oxford. Then came 1770. Whitefield travelled again through the American colonies despite alarming weakness. Those closest to him sensed something was wrong. His body appeared dangerously worn. Yet crowds still gathered everywhere he went. On one occasion, a friend urged him not to preach because he looked too ill. Whitefield reportedly replied, "I had rather die preaching than die doing nothing," and soon, that statement would become reality. On September 29, 1770, Whitefield arrived in Newburyport extremely exhausted. That evening, despite severe fatigue, he preached anyway. Witnesses later described how emotional and powerful the sermon felt, as though Whitefield sensed it might be his last. After preaching, he struggled to climb the stairs to his room. The next morning, September 30th, George Whitefield was dead. He was only 55 years old. News of his death spread rapidly across the colonies and England. Shock swept through churches and communities. Tens of thousands mourned him. Newspapers published tributes. People who had once opposed him even acknowledged the extraordinary impact of his life. But perhaps the most remarkable part of Whitefield's story was not simply the size of the crowds he preached to. It was the fire he left behind, because revival did not die with him. The Great Awakening had already reshaped spiritual history in both Britain and America. Countless pastors, missionaries, evangelists, and ordinary believers had been transformed through his ministry. Entire generations were influenced by the spiritual awakening he helped ignite. And yet, even now, George Whitefield's story remains deeply human. Not polished, not flawless, not simplistic. He carried extraordinary spiritual power while wrestling with painful weakness. He inspired nations while battling exhaustion privately. He preached grace passionately while still possessing serious blind spots and failures. And perhaps that is exactly why his life still speaks so loudly centuries later, because the untold struggles behind his revival power remind us that some of the brightest spiritual flames are often born in the deepest places of brokenness. But even after death, the debate surrounding George Whitefield would continue, and his complicated legacy would challenge future generations to wrestle with one difficult question: how do we remember a man who changed the world spiritually while remaining painfully imperfect himself? When news spread that George Whitefield had died, an unusual silence seemed to fall across the Atlantic world. In churches throughout England and colonial United States, people wept openly. Newspapers rushed to publish reports of his final moments. Letters traveled from town to town, describing the loss as though an era itself had ended. Crowds gathered simply to discuss the man whose voice had once thundered through fields, streets, and churches with astonishing force. Many struggled to imagine revival without him. For more than 3 decades, Whitefield had become one of the most recognizable figures in the English-speaking world. Long before modern celebrity culture existed, his fame crossed national boundaries. Farmers knew his name. Politicians discussed his influence. Skeptics debated him. Pastors admired him. Critics attacked him. Ordinary people remembered exactly where they stood when they first heard him preach. Even after death, His presence lingered powerfully in public memory. His funeral reflected the extraordinary reach of his ministry. Thousands mourned him. Many described the grief, almost like losing a family member. Some remembered the first sermon that awakened their faith. Others recalled moments when Whitefield's preaching had pulled them from despair, addiction, spiritual emptiness, or hopelessness. Entire communities traced their spiritual awakening back to one encounter with the preacher from Gloucester. But as history moved forward, another reality slowly emerged. George Whitefield's legacy was not simple. It was inspiring, complicated, powerful, and deeply controversial all at once. For generations, many Christians celebrated him primarily as a revival hero. Historians pointed to the enormous crowds he preached to and the spiritual awakening connected to his ministry. He helped popularize open-air preaching. He influenced evangelical Christianity across multiple continents. His emphasis on being born again shaped how countless believers understood conversion and personal faith. In many ways, Whitefield changed the language of modern Christianity itself. Before the Great Awakening, much of organized religion in England and America had become formal, intellectual, and spiritually cold. Whitefield's preaching reintroduced urgency, emotion, and personal transformation into public faith. He challenged the idea that Christianity was merely inherited tradition. Instead, he insisted people needed genuine spiritual rebirth. That message shook entire societies. Historians often describe the Great Awakening as one of the spiritual foundations that helped shape early American identity. Revival gatherings crossed social classes. Rich and poor stood together listening to sermons. Ordinary people began questioning religious authority structures. New denominations emerged. Missionary movements expanded. The emotional force of revival Christianity transformed public culture permanently, and at the center of much of it stood George Whitefield. Yet history also refuses to let us ignore his failures. As modern generations revisited his life more critically, painful contradictions became impossible to overlook. The most difficult issue involved slavery. Whitefield publicly supported the legalization and expansion of slavery in Georgia, partly because he believed enslaved labor would financially sustain his orphanage ministry. Though he occasionally criticized cruel treatment of enslaved people, he still participated in and defended a deeply oppressive system. For many readers today, this reality feels shocking and heartbreaking. How could a man who preached passionately about spiritual equality fail to recognize the horrific injustice of slavery fully? That question continues challenging historians, theologians, and believers alike. Some attempt to excuse his actions by pointing to the culture of the 18th century. Others argue that explanation is insufficient because even during Whitefield's lifetime, there were voices condemning slavery morally. The contradiction remains painful no matter how one examines it, and perhaps it should remain painful, because George Whitefield's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth about human nature. Spiritual gifting does not erase human blindness. A person may profoundly impact the world in one area, while still failing morally in another. Whitefield himself likely never imagined future generations would analyze his life so carefully. He probably assumed history would remember only the revivals, the sermons, the conversions, and the crowds. But history remembers everything: the victories, the weaknesses, the glory, the contradictions, and strangely, that complexity may make his story even more important. Because modern culture often prefers simplistic heroes or total cancellation, people are frequently placed into categories of either pure admiration or complete rejection. But real human beings rarely fit neatly into either extreme. George Whitefield certainly did not. He was capable of immense compassion, yet also serious moral failure. He preached grace powerfully, while remaining flawed himself. He inspired spiritual awakening, while carrying emotional wounds and blind spots. And perhaps this tension explains why his story still feels strangely alive centuries later. The deeper people study him, the more they realize revival itself carries mystery. Why does God use imperfect people so powerfully? Why do some individuals possess extraordinary spiritual influence while still battling weakness? Why do movements born from sincere passion sometimes become entangled with human failure? Whitefield's life does not offer easy answers. Instead, it forces uncomfortable reflection because his struggles were not merely historical, they remain deeply relevant today. Modern leaders still battle exhaustion beneath public success. Ministers still wrestle with loneliness while surrounded by crowds. Gifted communicators still face accusations of performance and manipulation. Spiritual movements still experience division, controversy, and criticism. And many people today still hide private brokenness beneath visible influence. In that sense, George Whitefield's story never truly ended. It simply changed generations. Even his preaching style continues shaping modern communication. Many historians consider Whitefield one of the earliest masters of mass persuasion in the English-speaking world. His dramatic storytelling, emotional connection, vivid imagery, and conversational delivery transformed public speaking itself. Before Whitefield, many sermons sounded formal and detached. After Whitefield, preaching became more personal, emotional, and direct. His influence can still be felt today in evangelical churches, revival meetings, and modern preaching styles across the world. Yet perhaps the most haunting part of his legacy is this: the man who moved massive crowds often carried hidden sorrow privately. That reality appears repeatedly throughout his life story. The poverty of his childhood, the humiliation at Oxford, the emotional collapse during his search for God, the criticism from religious leaders, the painful theological divisions, the strain in marriage, the grief of losing his son, the physical exhaustion that slowly consumed him, the loneliness hidden beneath fame, all of it formed the unseen foundation beneath the revival power people admired publicly. And maybe that is the true untold struggle behind George Whitefield's influence. Not merely the opposition he faced externally, but the internal weight he carried constantly while continuing to preach anyway. Because revival did not emerge from comfort, it emerged from surrender. Whitefield's life reminds us that powerful public impact often flows from deep private breaking. The sermons that shook nations were forged through suffering few fully understood. His authority did not come merely from education or talent. It came from desperation, weakness, dependence, and relentless conviction. Even his death symbolized that reality. He literally preached until his body could no longer continue. To some, that level of sacrifice appears inspiring. To others, tragic. Perhaps it was both. And now, centuries later, George Whitefield remains one of the most influential and controversial revival figures in Christian history. Some remember him as a spiritual giant. Others focus on his moral failures. Most serious historians acknowledge both. But regardless of perspective, one fact remains undeniable. The sickly innkeeper's son from Gloucester altered the spiritual landscape of two continents. His voice is gone now. The crowds disappeared long ago. The fields where he preached have fallen silent. Yet somehow, the questions his life raises still echo through history. Questions about revival. Questions about weakness. Questions about calling, sacrifice, failure, and grace. And perhaps the greatest lesson hidden inside George Whitefield's untold struggles is this: sometimes the people God uses most powerfully are also the ones most aware of how broken they truly are. Generate a grand conclusion of 150 words for the story and end it with a call to like, subscribe and share, and also drop a comment. George Whitefield's life was a collision of fire and frailty. He stood before nations with unmatched revival power. Yet behind the crowds was a man who battled exhaustion, criticism, heartbreak, loneliness, and deep personal weakness. His story reminds us that God often works through imperfect people shaped by pain, brokenness, and relentless surrender. Whitefield was not flawless, and history does not hide his failures, but his passion for awakening souls changed countless lives across generations. Even now, centuries later, the echoes of his sermons still challenge the modern world to pursue authentic faith instead of empty religion. His life proves that one person fully consumed by conviction can leave a mark history never forgets. If this story impacted you, make sure to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with others who need to hear this powerful story. And most importantly, drop a comment below what part of George Whitefield's journey challenged or inspired you the most.